who would have expected in 2022, even 2023, that you could have a conversation around artificial general intelligence and say, oh, yeah, I think we're a few years away from it. And they wouldn't laugh at you. I should be able to give it like a high level motivation, like increase the sales of this company, right? And it's going to go away and generate goals, which is hire 5 salespeople, change the product, set up new pricing so that I can increase sales, right? If you're trying to solve AGI, you're going to build these systems that are figuring out as much as possible for themselves. Nothing is external to the system. Otherwise, you're not going to get to AGI, right?
Ronald Ashri, hello there, my friend.
Ken Sims, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm good. I started the year saying, no matter what's going on, I will be relaxed.
Right.
They're making it very hard. I'm trying to stick to it.
Yeah. I started off this year on a little bit of a rampage, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just kind of like I was kind of like sidetracked a bit at the beginning of the year because I was, I had these big plans to sort of like get my diet under control. Signed up for a half marathon in February. Thought that's going to be the thing that's going to sort of like kick my ass in gear. Got a cold in the first week that lasted like 2.5 weeks, and this week's the first week that I've actually been feeling normal. So I'm off to a bit of a slow start. Yeah. But well, thanks for joining us. This is becoming a bit of a theme, actually, on VUX World, because the last, I think, 3 episodes in a row, Noam Fine from Here AI, Alan Nickel from Rasa, you, all 3 have been on the podcast in the past, obviously. Can you remember when it was?
It must have been 2019, 2018, 19 maybe.
Good effort. It was in 2021. Actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
2021, yeah. And what's interesting is that at the end of 2021, I gave a talk, and it was one of those. Do you remember when it was Voice Talks? It was called, and it was Google sponsored it. It was an online kind of live event thing, and it was all about Google Assistant and voice technologies and stuff like that. And informed in part by the conversation that we had in that year, and the approach that OpenDialog was taking, and also informed by conversations I'd been having at the time with companies like Got It AI and similar companies who are all using transformer models to kind of create more kind of fluid conversational experiences. You'd kind of, I don't know whether you were using large language models at the time, but you'd had a real good approach to abstracting a lot of the messiness of dialogue management away from people's consciousness. And then these other platforms are doing a really good job of leveraging transformer, as they were called then, transformer models, to kind of understand language a bit deeper. And that talk that I gave was like almost like a prediction of what conversation design might look like in the future. And
was that the one that you were on a board?
Yes.
Drawing? Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. That was the one. Yeah. And it kind of holds up a little bit, because I didn't look at it this year, but I think it might have been 2023 I was looking at it, and I was thinking that seems to be how it's shaping up. That so like, how have you, since 2021 to now, how have you been kind of progressing? How is OpenDialog doing, and what's the sort of like latest on your philosophy? Have you still got the same kind of philosophy, or have you changed the way you're thinking a little bit?
So it's fundamentally the same. The basic ideas remain the same. We have a specific way of framing conversation and breaking it down into individual layers and how we move between layers and so on. That all remains the same. What has really changed for us is with transformer models, generative AI, and so on, getting to a level of reliability and ease of use. It has transformed how we can integrate that into what we were doing. In many ways, it was the thing that we were missing, right? Like the ideas were all there, but then you kind of hit that last layer and you were fighting a bit with the NLU systems. And I framed it at the time as dealing with the shortcomings of NLU systems in that they couldn't keep track of context, they very easily got confused and so on. So you kind of layered the OpenDialog approach on top of that, and it fixed a lot of that for you. But there were still always limitations. It's now the other way around, where you have this generative models that, well, can go on forever, right? And can talk about anything. And the job of our framework is actually to constrain all of that and lead it to what you actually need it to be, as opposed to any open-ended conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And how has the last kind of, what is it now, 4 years nearly now, I suppose, what have been some of the, obviously, large language models, generative AI, those are the kind of, suppose, the top stories, if you like, but anything that you've observed in that time that's been a dramatic difference? Like, what is dramatically different now as opposed to then? Obviously, language understanding and as you mentioned, the generative capabilities, but is there anything else that you think has changed?
I think a big change has been people's perception of what this technology is. We went from a world where, like, let's face it, the broad understanding of chatbots at the time, like from 2018 to what, 2021, 2022 was, yeah, they're not really that great, are they? I mean, yeah, I get it, they can solve some problems, but they're not really that great. It has now changed into, what do you mean they cannot do X? Surely they can do everything. so from, and the conversations have changed completely from one where you are trying to explain to people what all this is, to one where you're really managing expectations, right? And you're saying, yeah, I know all of this is really exciting, but you're not ready for all of that. You need to go on a journey to be able to use this technology usefully within your organization. And I know you hear lots of really exciting things, but actually here's what is practical and will really help you. So there's a huge shift in, I mean, who would have expected in 2022, even 2023, that you could have a conversation around artificial general intelligence and say, oh, yeah, I think we're a few years away from it. Mm-hmm. And they wouldn't laugh at you. By the way, I'm not a believer, I don't think. I think we'll just keep massaging definitions to fit various agendas, and we'll get very smart things, but I'm not quite convinced we have all the paths tracked out. But hey, we have amazing tools. So that has changed. The other thing that has changed is if you go down to the level of products and what people are using, this understanding that you have aspects of your product, aspects of your tool that have a bit of intelligence in them, they will do something for you, is definitely a different expectation, right? And now you have new roles like AI product designer and AI product owner and so on, which are the people that are thinking, how are we integrating AI into whatever it is that we were doing?
Yeah, the product owner role is definitely something that has been, it's fairly common now, I suppose. In terms of OpenDialog, I almost called you OpenAI there. High praise indeed. In terms of OpenDialog,
I'm missing about 500 billion to invest in.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, if only. Yeah, that'd be interesting what happens to that. Actually, yeah, I was saying earlier on LinkedIn that you got OpenAI and SoftBank and stuff. They're kind of putting $500 billion into all this infrastructure stuff. China are going crazy on AI infrastructure, and then Keir Starmer comes out and is like, yeah. UK is going to be the capital of AI, and it's like, well, the analogy I was using is that like America and China are off the starting blocks and they're in the middle of the race, and we're kind of still in the changing room putting our socks on. But
well, you have to start, right? At least at least there is an effort or words in the right direction.
Hopefully that's it materializes. So in terms of open dialogue, you were saying there that, like, you know, over the course of the years, obviously generative AI gives us a strong. The way I kind of think about it is that it gives us a strong language understanding capability, which you alluded to earlier on, is like that's the frailties of the NLU system. It's just like, you know, you're never going to get accurate enough to understand everything. And even though generative AI doesn't understand everything, it will fail a lot more gracefully and all that kind of stuff. So there's a really good argument, and where I see it being really useful is, one is handling the complexities of language, which is that, you know, an NLU system trying to answer questions, you're going to have 300 intents to answer 300 questions, and 50 of them are going to be very similar. So you're going to have a real nightmare building a model that caters for that in any degree of accuracy, whereas retrieval augmented generation does a far better job at that. Again, failing gracefully, contextual kind of grounding and stuff like that is really good. Where I'm a little bit more on the fence is when it comes to executing processes, business logic, stuff like that. And, you know, that's the grounds and the area now where that stuff is being called agentic, in terms of large language models working through instructions that tell it what to do in certain scenarios. Where do you stand? I'll get your opinions on whether that's agentic or not. I don't think it is, but where do you stand on the role of large language models or small language models, and what they're good for and where they should stop short of? Do you see them infiltrating the business logic layer, or do you think that they're more appropriately used in the realms of language understanding? Like, how is OpenDialog utilizing it and thinking about it?
I think I would describe it as we take a very cautious view of that, in that if you are going to do that, so what we're essentially saying, right, is we're going to give a model a description of our business infrastructure. Here's a few things you can do. Here's some API calls you could consider. And we work mostly in regulated industries, right? So insurance and healthcare. So think of an insurance scenario, and someone comes along and says, hey, I need to update the address that you have on file, or the mileage that I do every year has changed, and I want to get a new quote, right? So I guess the pure large language model approach to this would be to say, here's a bunch of APIs that are going to manipulate this policy administration system. There is update mileage, go get a new quote, go figure out the security risks around this, the liability risks, and so on. Put all that together, give me a little plan of how I should call these different API methods, go run that plan, potentially write the code that's going to run that plan, and come back and tell me what's next. That's a bit of a stretch for insurance companies, right? And do you need it? Like, I think there's situations where it's interesting, where you're doing exploration. So if you read a lot of the examples, it's around, oh, we're going to go and research a bunch of different things, and we're going to ask questions in a bunch of different ways, and then we're going to compose a report on the back of that, right? And there's not necessarily a clear series of actions to take. We're just going to explore. So I'm going to send the LLM off to explore. Or I'm going to send the LLM to go talk to like an operator agent that's going to manipulate buttons and menus on a screen and try and do something. I think it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's worth exploring. It's not where I would have an insurance company or a healthcare provider start. I think your business process is preset, it's regulated, you have liability around it, you have the financial authorities to answer to. There's a bunch of things that you can do to take advantage of large language models without getting into all of that.
Yeah, I would agree. And fundamentally, you know, the way I've kind of been thinking about it is that if you can describe the process sufficiently enough to write a prompt, you can describe the process sufficiently enough to build it so that it doesn't vary any time at all, and it's consistent every time, and it's going to do the thing that you want it to do. It seems to be that there is influx of, I had this conversation on the last episode with Alan Nicol, or the previous one to that, with Alan Nicol from Rasa, which is that, you know, there's a lot of people interested in this stuff now that perhaps weren't in 2021 when we last spoke. So there's a lot more activity. There's a lot more people in the kind of industry, for want of a better phrase, and there's a lot more stuff going on. And because of that, there is also, you know, you mentioned earlier that maybe certain definitions of artificial general intelligence are perhaps being bent in line with the interests of the people creating the definitions. I feel as though we're probably at that point with agentic AI. I don't know whether you feel the same.
Yeah, and I mean, look, for me, it's a bit surreal to be having this sort of conversations. Now, I come from a background of I did my PhD in multi-agent systems, right? This was the early 2000s, and actually, I spent countless hours agonizing over the definition of agency because I had to describe it in formal logics, and my PhD is like a series of what now is very obscure symbols that saying this is what an agent is, and an agent has a goal, and an agent has motivations, and it has capabilities, and there's different types of agents, and it all builds up, right? So you can get very, very formal about this and really ground it into specific concepts. And now to have this conversation where we're essentially saying, if an LLM is writing a bit of a process for you and running it, that's an agent. I'm not, yeah, I don't want to say this is an agent or that is not an agent, like call it whatever you want. The question is, are you using that concept to help you design a better system or not?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the times we're just not doing that. We're not using the idea of an agent, this goal-driven behavior, to really design better systems. Like forget the technologies. Think about it from an architecture design or like a description of your system. Can you tell me specifically what the goals are? Can you tell me how do you know that you've achieved those goals of your agent? Then you could use LLMs to do it. There's a bunch of other technologies out there as well, right? Like it's not technology specific. It's a design stance. You're saying the way I'm going to break up my world is in terms of agents. And I'm going to think about this bit of software over here as having some capabilities and some goals, and it's going to go off and do them. And then this other bit of software over here has other capabilities and other goals, and maybe they have to work together, and I have a multi-agent system, or they work on their own. But I'm using a series of concepts to design a better system.
Mm.
And that's what agent-based software development or agent-based design is about. Then in order to realize the system, I'm going to use a series of technologies. And that can be large language models, and they definitely have their place, but it's not a necessary condition. You can talk about agents without large language models, and you can talk about large language models without agents.
Yeah. Very good description there. I'm just going to change this camera so that you can see what I see, because I want to show you a couple of bits here that I'm going to share with people. So I haven't had chance to read your article on Agents Decoded, but it's definitely something that is homework for me to do because it looks very interesting. And I think that basically explains in part kind of what you've just said there, I think. What I did fairly recently, that was January 20th, so literally 7 days before, was published. I released a Substack recently. I started a Substack, and the goal of that essentially is that it's to help essentially business leaders make sense of AI and to make better decisions. And what I did in this kind of thing here is all of the people who I imagine you are more than familiar with because you did your PhD in this sort of stuff. So this is all probably like child's play for you. But for me, this was all sort of like what I wanted to do is find out. There's been so much noise over the last 6 months about agents and agentic AI. I wanted to find out what on earth actually is it, because I don't feel as though it's being spoke about in the right kind of terms. And I know you're saying there that, you know, what you call it doesn't really matter because as long as you're kind of having the right design approach or whatever. But I actually think that what you call it does matter because the general kind of rhetoric at this moment in time is that AI agents are our saviors, and AI agents are going to be either disrupting the SaaS marketplace entirely. AI agents are going to be kind of like our personal companions that we've been longing for since the days of Amazon Alexa, and AI agents are going to radically transform the way that your business operates. Then when you look under the hood, all of these new kind of newly crowned influencers and startup technology companies, they've got basically workflow if this then that logic. Some of it uses LLMs, some of it uses third parties like Make and N8N and stuff like that. It's all if this then that programs, and they leverage some large language models in places and stuff like that. But so it seems to me as though there's certain technology companies that are riding on this interest and market awareness of the term AI agent, and then selling old wine in new bottles, which is the stuff that they've always done. So that was kind of the reason for putting this together. And it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on it, because one of the things in here is that Michael Wooldridge, who I'm sure you kind of know about, mentions in this bit that the reason to define it is so that it doesn't get basically misused. And I think that's where we are now, is it's fundamentally being misused. There's some stuff in here about where it comes from and all that kind of stuff. But then you were talking earlier on about, you know, the qualities and whatnot, and this comes basically from Franklin and Grassi, I want to say, I don't know if that's the term, but it's a brilliant paper, and I'll link to it as part of this this episode. You might be familiar with it, but they essentially, this is what they arrived at in terms of the definition. I'll go for that in a second, but they essentially went through all of the sort of like leading definitions of agents and multi-agent systems stemming from the days of distributed artificial intelligence and stuff like that, and arrived at a definition. And as I was going through it, I'm like, exactly as you said, this is completely technology independent. This definition and the qualities of an agent doesn't matter about the technology. Whether you call it a generative AI agent or not is besides the point. Agents should conform to certain qualities in order for them to be considered autonomous or agents, if you like. And I don't feel as though most of the conversations happening in this space at the moment actually are grounded in what that accepted definition of agents are.
So I both agree with you completely and disagree, which is, and let me try and explain. So there is a point where I categorize all the marketing speak around AI agents right now is that people essentially grabbed onto this term to talk about automation.
Yeah.
What all of this is automation. Now, we've talked about automation. We've done RPA, right? Robotic process automation. We've done virtual assistants. We've done chatbots. We've done intelligent assistants. Like, we've gone through this whole series of terms. And now we've arrived at AI agents. This is a new thing. And it captures, again, at this very high level, two important points. The first one is broad automation. The other one is it's beyond just a conversation. It's beyond just answering questions. They go and do things. That's essentially what AI agents mean to the broad world. These pieces of software that go and do things. And, they use Gen AI models. Yeah, it's all very complicated and so on, right? And that's simplifying enormously, but that's where it sits in the broad collective of people. And I'm not going to fight that because I cannot fight that. Then I'll say, okay, let's leave that to the side and let's talk about building applications, thinking about systems, and what can the abstraction of an agent bring to you. And that's the bit that I'm interested in, because that's the bit that helps me build a better system. If I think of my conversational application, my chatbot, in terms of agent qualities and abstractions, does that help me build a better system? If I think of automating a certain process in terms of agent abstraction and qualities, does that help me build a better system? Now, in that space, I agree with you that definitions are really important. In the marketing space, I also agree with you. It's just that I'm not going to fight that battle. You're much better placed to go out there. You have way more energy than me to go and tell people, all this is BS. Stop talking about it. I'm going to worry more on the practical side of things. How do we use agent abstractions to build better systems? Because I think we can really benefit from it, right? Like OpenDialog, our tool, it started out by saying we are designing a multi-agent system. And the way we use abstractions at the first level is to say you have at least two agents, the human and your software program, your chatbot or whatever you want to call it, that are talking to each other, right? And they have different goals, and the system as a whole has a goal, and they need to communicate, collaborate, coordinate to solve a problem together. That is the definition of a multi-agent system. So we started by using those abstractions to say this is going to help us build a better system. Now, if you look at LLMs and how they're using agents, I would argue they're in the very early days of making use of agent abstractions. There are some systems like Autogen from Microsoft.
Mm.
They're making like interesting use of agent abstractions to enable them to build better systems. So Autogen is saying, look, you have a big problem you want to solve. Instead of giving it to a single LLM with a prompt and so on, give it to a team of agents. And each agent is going to have certain capabilities, and they're going to go away and do certain things, and they'll share information. It's like the first paper of Autogen simply says, this is a better way of solving complex problems. Break it down into smaller problems that individual agents deal with. Call that a team, have your team go away and do things, come back and give your result. And you can also intervene along the way, right? So that's a good use of using the term agent to do something. If we go to LangChain, or Hugging Face recently released something they call small agents. And they're essentially saying an agent is a program where the outputs are managed by an LLM. That's not a good use of the abstraction of an agent. It doesn't give me anything. Like, how does that help me?
Mm.
Okay, and then even worse, and I'm going to get myself into trouble here, but why not? Let's have fun. They go and they say, oh, I'm going to give my agent stars, right? As if it's like a Michelin restaurant. And so a 0-star agent just has like I think it's a single prompt. A 1-star agent is a bit more complicated, and they go up to 3-star agents where you have something that does its own planning, maybe writes its own code, and so on and so forth. Okay. Therefore, how does that help me think of my system in a better way? What you're telling me is there's a piece of software, I'm going to give it some instructions, and it's going to go away and write some code and execute that code in order to achieve that goal. It doesn't help me design a better system. It gives that thing a name, but it doesn't help me design a better system. And that's the space I think we should dive in a bit deeper and then be a bit more critical with ourselves and say, how does this help me?
Mm.
I'll stop my rant there.
No, that's very good. There's a few things I think we could tag on to that. In that piece I was talking about, and I'll link to it as part of this, I actually went away and I had a look at how does Google define agent, how does Microsoft define it, how does OpenAI define it, LangChain, Anthropic. And it's so interesting to look at the way that they go about it. And going back to what you were saying earlier in terms of like the definition of AGI is defined by those who have an interest in it. And it's exactly the same thing here. The vendors that describe it will describe it in a way that aligns with what they can do, as opposed to what you would call a proper definition. So Google's call to action is basically, they kind of say, well, it's too hard to define, you can't really define it, so we're not going to bother. But really, they can follow rules, or they can be kind of like, make up their own sort of like processes, etc. But if you want to build them, then go and use Dialogflow CX. Dialogflow CX is the most deterministic piece of software I've ever seen in my life.
But even that idea of, they're either following rules or they're making their own rules. What does that mean? Like, how does that help me? I think I want them to follow rules. I don't know, just just instinctively, I follow rules, please. Like, is it better or is it worse? Like, it's interesting that they can go away and do some planning. It's really interesting. It can solve some problems. But saying unless it goes and does its own plan, don't call it an agent. Like, even if you look at that, the days of Mike Woodridge and Nick Jennings and so on, and talking about AI agents and talking about proactive, reactive, and socially able and autonomous and so on. Each one of those terms is a very complex term. Like, you have to break into it and really break it apart in order to be able to build a system using it, especially autonomy. Because what does autonomy mean, right? Like, are we autonomous? Like, you can get really philosophical about it. The fact that you are here and I'm here and we're having a conversation, was that our own choice, or was it a result of all the rules that we followed in our life that got us to this moment today? Are we real? Like, what does it mean? So if you're building software systems, it has to mean something very specific. You have to be able to translate it in code and say, this is what autonomy means. And there's, I think I'm appreciating that a bunch of different people are saying, actually, you know what? It's a spectrum. This is not an agent, and it is an agent. There is very simple agents and very complicated agents, right? And the way I think of it is I actually divide it into, so you start with the idea of a goal. I want you to go and achieve something. From a design perspective, I could even say, I don't care how you achieve it, as long as you achieve it, right? So if you can achieve it with a single line of code and it's if, then, else, good on you, it's amazing, keep doing it. If you need to go and engage with 5 LLMs over 5 hours, well, okay, that's how you're going to achieve it, right? But you have a goal. And I need to be able to tell when that goal is done. So it has to be describable. It has to be something that I have a way to read that environment and say, yes, the goal is achieved or it's not achieved. Now, if I give you that goal, I don't call that thing autonomous, right? And that's just my definition of autonomy. I say that what that thing has is self-direction. It can direct itself, but it's been assigned a goal. It said, I want you to get the ideal temperature in this room. You can go manipulate a bunch of different things. You can switch on the air conditioner. You can switch on heating. You can drive more energy into the building. You can do whatever you want. But the end result is that this room is going to be at a specific temperature, and you cannot go do anything else. You cannot generate a new goal on the back of that. So you have some self-direction. And then the way I define autonomy is when you're building systems that can actually generate their own goals. So it might be, if we take it back into the AI agents that they're talking about today, if you're telling me that, you're building my chief financial officer AI agent and it's going to replace my human CFO, I should be able to give it like a high level motivation, like increase the sales of this company, right? And it's going to go away and generate goals, which is hire 5 salespeople, change the product, set up new pricing so that I can increase sales, right? And that's more of an autonomous system. And you can sort of keep going up and down the spectrum, right? And saying you have more tools or less tools to achieve these things, but you have to be clear. And the definitions, I think a lot of what is driving the definitions that are coming from Google, Anthropic, OpenAI is serving their own purpose, which is they said, look, we've given you this LLM and we've given you this thing called tools, and we've put tools behind the LLM, and we're saying you can, through the LLM, use the tools. And we want you to keep using this. And actually, we want you to kind of go wild with it, right? Do you need to? Most of the time, you don't. There is very few use cases where you really need to just let things go wild. We're going to get to more in the future, Well, we're not ready right now. What we're doing is we're completely embedding our capabilities within the tools of these providers that are then saying, unless you do it this way, it's not a 3-star agent. And who wouldn't want a 3-star agent? Why would you go to the terrible restaurant doesn't even have a star when you can have a 3-star restaurant, right?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. So there's a combination there of on the marketing side, increasing kind of like customer acquisition, but then also there is a sort of like the reward element there of saying that, you know, in order to be the star pupil, you should really be using, you know, the more advanced 3-star agents, when in actual fact, you know, solving the problem that you've got might be able to be done as you described in one line of code and all that lot, you know.
And again, this is not necessarily driven by very kind of nefarious, we want you to consume more. They are actually trying to solve different problems. They want to get to AGI, right? I don't think you will be able to get to AGI unless you have something that is able to do all its planning itself and have access to all the tool itself and go wild and do it, right? And they want as much data around that as possible. And they're building systems that use that way of doing things in order to generate the data to go do it. And that's fine. Go for it. We don't know where it's going to take us, but go for it. But if I am an insurance company and I want to do a policy change to my insurance, I don't know that I need to follow that process.
That's a very interesting way of describing it that I've never heard before, which is that, I mean, it is very common that a technology company would release something for the sole purposes of gathering data in order to prove the value of something or prove the market fit of something or whatever it might be. You could probably argue that ChatGPT in its first iteration was that. You know, let's release it as a product. They didn't expect it to turn into what it is today. So I think you can't compare what it is today compared to what it was. When they released it, it was released as a beta to say, we want you to go and test this thing, because what we really want to do is we want to learn the kind of stuff you're going to ask it and how you're going to interact with it and all this kind of stuff so that we can then better improve our models. And so that's obviously the tactic. But what's interesting in terms of what you were just explaining there is to think about agentic AI and the tools that companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, etc., are building, who have got more money than they need and more runway than they need. They can quite easily have these tools existing for years and not have to make any money from them. But if that, as you're saying, is the case, which is that actually what they're doing is releasing these tools to get people using them, to then learn whether or not they're on the right track for being able to then leverage that stuff to then enhance their AGI efforts, is an incredibly interesting avenue that I've never thought of before.
I think it's a big research experiment. And again, it's not necessarily conscious. It's just that's the problem they're trying to solve is AGI. Like they all state that very clearly. And if you're trying to solve AGI, you're going to build these systems that are figuring out as much as possible for themselves. Like nothing is external to the system. Otherwise, you're not going to get to AGI, right? It has to do its own planning. It has to have access to tools. All of that is necessary. But then those systems are presented to organizations as this is the way to do automation. And it's not the only way to do automation, right? And again, I'm not saying that there aren't use cases that are interesting. Like if you want to go explore 1 million different documents from 10 different perspectives, writing a team of agents that goes away and does a bunch of things is probably a very interesting way to do it. But simpler processes, you don't need to. I actually did a bit of research on papers that have said, okay, let's take these agents and let's have them in situations like the ones that OpenAI and Anthropic are describing, right? So they're running a company, or they're talking to patients and they're trying to cure them, or they're doing research and so on. And consistently, this is across 7 or 8 different studies at scale. What they came back with is this is just not ready. Like there's a paper called The Agent Company. And the best they got to with Claude, the model from Anthropic, is 24% success rate. And what they did is they defined a bunch of tasks that you would expect a junior worker to do within an organization, like go on the equivalent of Slack and talk to these people and onboard a new person, clone a repository, check in with your boss, and so on. And beyond the fact that it only got 24% of those tasks done, they then realized there's some really funny but disconcerting characteristics. And the anecdote that sticks out for me is they sort of told the agent, go talk to George and tell him that it's done. And the agent couldn't find George in the chat program. And then what the agent did is it picked another user, named them, like it picked David, called David George, who changed their username, and said, George, I'm done. It's like, job done, off I go, right? And for the agent, it achieved its goal. And so I wouldn't let these things run completely crazy in my organization. They're not quite ready yet, AI agents in that form. What you can do is lots of really cool, interesting solutions to the problems that you have today. That's using LLMs. Absolutely, go ahead and do it. Worry less about AI agents.
Very good. I think the thing when it comes to AGI, there's a lot of people out there who really just don't think that LLMs are the precursor to it anyway. You look at Jan LeCun's quite critical of it, and Gary Marcus is quite critical of it. Peter Voss, like all these people are very much critical of the probability nature of these models, and the way that they're constructed is a big barrier. But you mentioned earlier that to bring this back to what's more relevant for businesses that want to leverage this technology, you mentioned earlier on that there are ways in which you can think about abstracting the qualities of an agent to be able to build more effective programs. And so there's a number of qualities that agents have. We've mentioned autonomy. We've perhaps spoke about kind of like proactivity, the ability to make decisions and plan and reason and all these kind of things that kind of come with it. How do you think about abstracting these qualities to build a better system? How have you leveraged this kind of thinking, if at all, to be able to make OpenDialog more effective since we last spoke?
So the thing that has been really useful for us is, very briefly, like at the top level, the abstraction that OpenDialog uses is to say, I am creating this space within which I'm going to put software programs, and I'm going to put users, and I'm going to define what are the possible interactions, right? What is the types of things that I want to be saying at any given point.
So that's the going back to the agent parallels. That's the environment you're describing there.
That's the environment. I place these agents in within the OpenDialog orchestration engine. We treat the human being as just another agent. So it can execute actions. We have this concept of intent. It's kind of a high level concept of intent, but and now it's driven by LLMs and so on. But we're still saying, there's certain things like it can ask questions, or it can ask for something to be done, or it could say something that is not appropriate. There's all those things there, right? Now, what we can do, because what we end up is with this conversational graph that says, these are the sort of different states of the world that I'm interested in. And we can define at the top of the graph the overall goal, like, submit an insurance claim. And as you go down the graph, and we have these concepts of conversations and scenes and turns, you're essentially defining smaller goals. And you're telling the LLM, look, you are at step 3 of your insurance claim. It's an insurance claim. That's your top level goal. That you're collecting, information about who the other party in this claim is. That's your local goal, right? And I want you to have a conversation about it until you've achieved that goal. And then we'll be ready to move on to something else. right? So you're capturing this hierarchy of goals from the top level goal down to very specific goals. And at each point, you can constrain the LLM in a bunch of different ways to say, here's where I need you to focus the conversation right now. You need to worry much less about things like conversation history and the ability of users to kind of sidetrack the LLM and get it to do different things just because they're having a long ongoing history of interactions. Because you're saying, my goal, my local goal is this, which is based on a higher level goal, which is based on my overarching goal. So you have this goal-driven structure of conversations. And then together with that, when you're actually executing actions, you can describe those things in terms of goals.
Right. So would it be fair to say then, if I understand this correctly, that you're using the concept of the environment in terms of, and the user is part of that, because you're classing the user as an agent, which is, I think, is a quite unique approach. Within that environment, you have that conversational structure that you mentioned, conversation, scenes, turns. And then at each level of that, the system, for want of a better phrase, has goals that correspond to the overarching goal, and that then gets turned into local goals. Are you using large language models or small language models or those type of models to manage the kind of what am I trying to say? The kind of like the navigation through the goals and scenes and stuff like that? Or are you using more predefined and predetermined logic?
No, well, depending on what you're trying to achieve, you can decide what to use. So there's certain types of conversations where it's more appropriate to have a large language model at a couple of different levels, kind of taking control. So you give it a specific goal, you give it a few different things that it can do, and you let it take control of the conversation and manage the navigation through the different spaces. There are other situations like, I guess the best example is, you've gone through a bunch of things and now you're doing payments. Like you're literally putting in your credit card. It's connecting to some system like whatever the new name for Sage is, or WorldPay and so on. These are very painful backend systems to connect into. We are not letting the large language model decide what to do next. There is a very precise thing that's going to happen there. Your payment is either going to go through or not. We might use LLMs there for the actual conversation. You might have a question around like a more typical FAQ style question, so you can plug that in, but you're not going to guide the process. The process is set. Right? So you get to choose where do you want to really open it up and let the user and the agent on the other side sort of explore, and where you want to narrow it down and say, no, it's step 1, step 2, step 3, and it's pretty much those are your choices.
Well, a lot of business processes for a lot of companies, they are fairly static, and they may change over time, but a lot of them are kind of fairly static. And so when it comes to that sort of more localized goal, is it that the kind of those goals are predetermined? So an example of that would be like, one way of thinking about it perhaps is that in a conversation, let's use the insurance company example, in a conversation where I want to change my address, there are going to be certain steps that need to be gone through. Don't have to necessarily be done in the right order necessarily, but there are certain things that have to be achieved in that conversation. I need to be verified. Probably should come first. You then need to figure out, like, are you talking about this address? Like, let's confirm the thing that you want to change. The next stage is, what's the next thing that needs to be updated? So where are you actually going to move to? Things all around, like, when are you going to move? And if it's insurance, when do you want your policy to start at the new, or you're adding someone to your car or whatever. So it's like, there's certain things that absolutely have to be done. Presumably those things for me would need to be specified. They need to be, grounded. You'd need to say, like, these are the things that are going on. And then from there, there's in my mind, there's two ways of approaching that. One way is to say, actually, you've got to go through it in this order. And I don't really care about how you get from one stage to another. I don't care whether or not you take somebody's address by asking for the postcode first and then the house name and then you confirm it, or if they just give you it all in one and you verify. I don't really care about that. That's dialogue management. It's not process. But I care about the process.
Yeah.
So how are you approaching it? Is it that you have that approach where basically the process is the thing that's defined and the dialogue management is the bit where there's a degree of autonomy, if you want to use that word? Or is it that you open up the large language models to be involved in the process and the business logic and stuff like that?
So I would say 90% of cases, the process is defined and you spend more time in the dialogue management, right? And you spend more time in maybe you're going through a process and you have a few questions about the process, right? So there's a bit of dialogue management there to say, oh, what does this mean? How could I do this? Would I be able to do something different? But then you're always bringing it back to the process. Then there is a smaller set of cases where you can actually open up the process a bit more. And this is where it gets a bit more interesting in you can let the large language model reason a bit more about what's going on, right? So if to give you a very simple example without getting into a lot of detail, say I want to update the mileage and I put in 500,000 miles, right? So you allow the model there to do some common sense reasoning with huge quotation marks around it. Say that's probably not doesn't quite make sense, and maybe we decide to take a different path because actually you've tried this a few times now, so we're going to take a different path down the conversation because this is now starting to raise flags for us around what it is you're actually trying to do with the system, right? And it can get a bit detailed around that, but those are the more interesting cases. Or you have situations where you're just trying to arrange like for a car pickup. And the business actually has something like 20 different processes based on whether you're actually available for the pickup, you're not happy with how your car was fixed, you're going to be available later in the day. We even have a process which is I'm going to put the keys underneath the vase. In front of the door, like literally that. So you let the large language model do some of that reasoning and pick some of the paths, but it's preset. It's not going to invent path number 18 that no one has ever heard of before and take the user down that path. Right? Like, that just is not going to work in a regulated environment.
But you're specifying in the prompt, if this scenario happens, you should treat it like this, and if that scenario happens, you should treat it like that. But you're not coding it up. You're kind of giving the instruction to the model so it can handle some of that stuff. Yeah.
A way to describe this is saying, and I hate anthropomorphizing, but it's kind of that, right? You have this new employee, and you're saying, here's how the business works. Here's some of the things that you can do. The rest where you shouldn't be doing, and you write that up in English language most of the time, and those are your instructions. It's not code. And then that gets mapped to specific paths down a conversation and different contexts where and at the same time, you're also feeding things like specific information about the user, right? So these are some of the things, but it's this sort of user with this sort of attributes. So I want you to reason about it in a different way and so on. And that's incredibly powerful. And what we've seen, like my worry initially is that we wouldn't be able to tie this down enough to get good results for people or organizations. What we're seeing is you can actually define this. If you break the problem down appropriately, you can get to really high level of fidelity. And the way we test it is we send this to underwriters, right? That have zero interest in being nice about anything. And they just go through the different answers and so on and say, yes, no, maybe this could change and all of that. And it's good to see that, you get above 90% success if you break the problem down enough. And that's exciting, right? But it's not the LLM inventing new business processes. It's you telling it what you can do as an organization.
Yeah, and I think that's for me. That's where they work perfectly. And if you were to if you were to summarize basically like what was the problem, you at the very top of the show you mentioned that there was a problem with the old chatbots because no one liked them and they weren't working all the time and stuff like that. Like, if you could summarize the problem of the old chatbots, it's exactly that. They didn't understand everything, and therefore they were difficult to use, and so it ended up in not so great experiences. The value of the generative models is that they do a much better job at understanding, so they can deal with the messiness of language and they can deal with all of the complexities of grounding and all that kind of stuff. You can still leverage the deterministic requirements of a business process, but replacing the NLU with an LLM, and also some of the manual script writing that you used to have to do replacing with an LLM, so that you benefit from the flexibility of the dialogue, which is the main thing. Like, in terms of the experience, like, you have to be able to show that you've understood somebody with contextual responses, and you have to be able to actually understand them enough to be able to do what it is that they need. But the business process bit sort of stays the same. So it seems as though now that platforms like OpenDialog and quite a few others, they've kind of arrived at this kind of like really perfect kind of blend for me, it seems, which is that the business process has still got reliability, and you can still define it, and you can still have it do exactly the same thing every single time where it needs to, but you can benefit from the conversational nature of language models so that the experience can be great. So now, what's missing?
Very good question. I think the first bit is the world catching up. Yesterday, we were talking to an organization, and they're still doing intent. Like, they're still fighting with example phrases and all of that. Like, they've not moved into generative AI at all. So there is a bunch of old stuff that needs to move into this new stuff. Then there is the rest of the world, because the majority of organizations I would talk to are doing nothing. They don't have any of this, right? So they can catch up with this. Like, there is years of work that just needs GPT 4.0 mini. It doesn't need anything else. Just organizations catching up with how they could benefit from GPT 4.0 mini. The next layer, and this is something that we're having fun with right now, is saying, okay, how can we build better experiences? Let's break out of the chatbot. Right now, obviously you have multi-modal as well. You can think of a different layout in your page. It doesn't need to look like a chatbot. It can you can get really ambitious in terms of how you drive your UIs. That much bigger part of the UI is driven by an LLM, right? And it's presenting the right bits of information in the right places and so on. So you're taking a lot of advantage of all the things that you can do on a web page beyond just talking to something. But it's still dynamically being driven by an LLM. And it's still a conversation. It's just a different type of conversation, right? And I guess a good example of that that maybe more people would have seen is Claude and the way it does artifacts, right? So it's that sort of thing. What we used to call our web chat widget is now more of a chat UI, and it's all sorts of different interface elements, and they all plug into how you drive the conversation, and all that data can feed back into the LLM and drive more of a richer interaction on the page. That's exciting. Then the other thing is agents, right? That it is things that go and do things for you, and maybe they even go and take some time and they explore a bit more. We're going a bit crazy about how much we think this can achieve for us right now, but it will get there. It will get there.
Yeah, very good. I like that concept of the dynamic user interface. For years the chatbot has been confined to this little bottom corner of the screen, but the problem is that it consumes all of your attention, and so all of a sudden you go from having all of this screen real estate to everyone's attention being just focused on this little tiny bottom corner rectangular widget. It seems like a total waste, And then you've got kind of like yes, fair enough. Some companies are better than others in terms of making use of the UI. So like for me, like we've got these AI design principles, and one of the principles essentially is using the right modality for every single turn in the conversation, because if you used a payment reference earlier on, if you want to collect a payment from someone, you're not going to ask them for the card number. You may as well have a great example I've seen is where you actually just have an animation or a visual of a card, and the field to type in the card number is where the card number should be, and the three digits where the three digits could be. So you're basically typing into the credit card. It's very clear what you should do, very clear what information needs to go where, and so you don't have to use dialogue for absolutely everything. But still, we're mostly confined to this little widget in the bottom corner, whereas I've seen some examples, I haven't seen any in production yet that are any good, but some examples where ChatGPT is probably the best example, where it can in part change the UI. If you ask it to generate a document for you, you can then expand it and the document becomes full screen. You can edit the document, but then you can still have the chat on the side to change it. So it's almost like I agree definitely that has to be the next phase, is to view a website not as a website, but to view it as an interaction with the user. And how can you blend together the large language models, the conversations, and the visual UI to create this melting pot of the ideal modality for the turn, every turn.
There's this paradigm for a new type of application, right? And kind of at the basis of it is this idea of a conversation. Then there is multiple interfaces through which you can have a conversation, and the interfaces can mix, and as you say, they can adapt to the type of conversation that you're having. There is actions that this application can take, so it can go and do things for you. And all of this is tied with an orchestration layer. Like those four elements, conversations, interfaces, actions, orchestration, is kind of the new paradigm of an application. And it's no longer a chatbot or anything like that. It's your application. But it is driven by a conversation and LLMs and this notion of turns and context that change and so on. So yeah, I think we're just starting with that, right? We're just scratching the surface on that.
I definitely concur with that, and I look forward to basically having this similar conversation again in a little while's time and see where we're at, basically, because that's for me the exciting part is blending all this stuff together to make really great experiences,
Or we'll all walk through the 500 billion Stargate and we're off.
Yeah, easy. Just as simple as that. Nice. Ron, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Likewise.
Always a pleasure talking to you. Really, really appreciate you spending some time with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Nice one. And thank you all for tuning in. Talking about design and design paradigms, I might be able to drop a little kind of interesting tidbit here, which is that I'll be joined, if all goes to plan and the schedule stays as it currently is and the guy turns up, I'll be talking to Jacob Nielsen very soon about this exact thing, the combination of large language models and UI, what that means for the future of design. So looking forward to that one.
That's really cool.
Yeah, nice one. Cool. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks now. Bye.